Thank you. I want to echo my colleague who went before me. Thank you for all still being here today on this Friday afternoon. I hope you have capacity to take in more information. I don't know that I have capacity to give you this information. So we'll figure this out. Yes, collective pathway towards Black Joy. I want to add that this is actually a picture from a Black Joy parade in Oakland, California. They have these annually. So there are things going on out there. It's just not just us talking about this. But so anyways, what I'm presenting to you today stems from my doctoral thesis. I keep going. Okay. That stems from my doctoral thesis and some of the key findings. So it's the first time, which I defended last week. So it's the first time that I'm kind of putting this idea together in front of people. That was not the point, but thank you. So bear with me. So basically, the overview of my research was based on the experience of mental health treatment in Afro-Caribbean communities in the greater Montreal area. And the problematic was based on the fact, and it's quite interesting that Dr. Jarvis was talking about this today, but this overrepresentation of coerced use of, of services and this underrepresentation of mental health service use and issues that, as we all know, and that's why we're kind of all here, we know that cultural aspects, cultural issues, ethnic issues, racial issues have all underlined why people are not using the services. And yet we're still stuck at this place where the services are still not pertinent for the people and people are still not using them. And these are observations that we're seeing in most Western countries, so US, Canada, and the UK. And part of the purpose of this research was, of course, for professionals and for institutions to hear about this and why it was pertinent. And was also to know, why are people not using services? It's always a good thing to kind of ask them. And these are things that we tend not to do. But the gist of the research is to really raise awareness within the community, the fact that there's raise awareness and decrease stigma. So we, the community, could be Black communities is always, if we don't talk about it, it's kind of not happening. And so if it's not happening, we don't need to talk about it. And provide so people could hear their stories, see their stories, and kind of, want to take action if and when they want to. The idea is also to advocate and develop services that are more appropriate to the community's needs. So that was part of the purpose of my research. And the sample was so I used a narrative life story approach. So the sample was 8 people, 7 people of Haitian descent, and 1 person from Grenada, who all identified as Caribbean and Black. Half of them were first generation, second half was second generation. And so the life stories were between 1 and 4 hours, which is about like 100 pages of transcript, FYI. And they all had to have received a psychiatric diagnosis and a plan of treatment, but they didn't have to have followed it. And 5 major themes came out of the research. One about, of course, the invisibility of mental illness, the idea of what being mentally ill and being normal looks like. What's related to requests for help and service trajectory, what actually influences that. And then there's 2 things that lie under the social environment. So family as a protective factor and as a stress factor. They're both. They play both parts all the time. And the Afro-Caribbean community itself, and more particularly to the idea of the lack of representation, the relationship with religion, which is part of community and also influences kind of family values and family development as well. And finally, the taboos and rejection within the community. And this is kind of the last piece that's important for us today. And so what came out, one of the very important things that came out of the research under an intersectional perspective is this fact that we keep wanting to see the world in kind of silos and parallels and unique identities. So what happens with people who are of African descent, so who are Black, who are immigrants, who also have mental illness or mentally ill or having some kind of psychic distress, is that when they reach regular services where the dominant group is Caucasian, they are not being seen and they're not being understood, and the services are not pertinent to them because of their minority status in terms of race, ethnicity, and culture. However, when they are in the community, so when they're in the Afro-Caribbean community where the Afro-Caribbean people are the majority, then the mental illness identity becomes a minority identity, and they are also erased from that perspective. And then you could tie in other identities. And so basically, and this is what I kind of saw in my research. So when I was calling organizations to kind of recruit people, the standard mainstream institutions were like, well, there are no Black people who use our services. And then the Black community resources were like, well, we don't have any mentally people with, mental disorders who use our organizations. So this was very illustrative of where I'm going with this. And what stood out is that the bigger, the thing that caused the greatest harm and distress on recovery well-being is this piece. Is really the fact that there was invisibility within the community and rejection within the community that people identified with. So this was I don't know if maybe it's too small, but it's a quote from one of the participants. It is the idea that there's stigmatization within stigmatization in the same community. You end up with labels in your own community. So when a white person does that to you, what's the big deal? Why shouldn't a white man be able to do it, given you people can't even stand each other and get along? All right. So the case for intersectionality, which has been mentioned a lot today, we talk about it a lot, but what does that actually look like when we're talking about mental health and mental health in the Black community? Oh.
Please go back to that slide. Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. So what does that look like in the community? So it's really the idea that when we're looking at mental health, mental illness, we have to consider the race, ethnicity, the culture, mental illness, and every other intersecting identity within this person, because they're all concurrently having an impact on how this person navigates the world, how this person is understood, and what the person's needs are going to be to help them get better and recover. And so what does identity matter? In this case, when I'm talking about the Afro-Caribbean identity, what we see is that the experience of marginalization within a community creates isolation for people of African descent, and it doesn't help their recovery. So when we are rejecting people from minority identities who consider and identify as Black, we are harming them. And so the rejection is also has an impact on symptoms of depression and anxiety. So it's not just navigating a racist world, it's also navigating a marginalized world for being who you are, which also has an impact on mental wellness. So there's a link between the rejection by those we value has a more significant impact on mental health in racialized communities. So this is why Black identity matters for us. And so links to racial identity as a whole. And when I'm talking about racial identity, I'm really talking to the idea of how we identify to ethnic, cultural, and racial communities where we feel like we belong. So the community where we feel that we belong as human beings and share characteristics of the group. Influence social development. So we're talking about things that are related to growth, personal development, personal growth. Whoever was here yesterday when we're talking about generational transmission of values, of trauma, of good things or bad things. This is also related to how we develop racial identity in our children and the people around us in our communities, and how we help people make sense of their realities. And it's a protective factor. So positive racial identity is actually a protective factor against psychic distress linked to racial discrimination and internalized racism. So people who are very grounded in their racial identity are going to be less hurt, less harmed navigating a racist world. And based on what we heard today, the evolution is slow. So if you're waiting for the evolution to happen, we got to go back and see how can we, and when we're talking about healings and things like that, is the idea of how do we contribute to this from our own community standpoint. And so it's also a primordial element in the actualization of human beings. So it's always interesting to understand when people want to destroy, when we talk about colonization, the first thing that people try to destroy where there's war is people's culture, language, and identity. And what does being Black mean? And that's where we're also part of the responsibility and the accountability takes place. Whose Blackness is allowed to be protected as Black people and as Black community? And when we're talking about Blackness, and it's where I'm going back with the idea of mental illness as a minority identity within this majority of Black communities, is every single identity deserves to be protected. So when we are homophobic, when we are anti-trans, we have to understand that trans people basically already have, let's say, higher levels of psychological distress, suicide. And so this is multifold when they are Black. So if we are against these things, we are also contributing to anti-racism policies and practices. So Blackness is all of these things that need to be considered and supported so that people's racial identity, people's well-being and social development could actually be able to move forward. And so that's our responsibility as a community. As I mentioned, the impact of being rejected from your cultural, racial, and ethnic community is greater on psychological distress than being rejected by the dominant white group. Okay. And so what does Black joy have to do with this? So many things when we're talking about identity development. And I'm totally stealing this quote from Professor Williams at the University of Toronto, who's in the Department of Education, Michelle Grace Williams. And she says that this Black joy is this state of psychic contentment and enduring feelings of enoughness. Tell all your Caribbean parents about this, being enough. What does that look like? Racial pride, despite, deficit narratives about Black identities. So we have to be intentional about developing identities because, oh my God, I have 3 minutes. Okay. Because the narrative, the dominant narrative is a negative one. It's always this idea that, Black people their being is lower within the hierarchy, though we say, things are changing, but this is still like the undertone. So we have to be intentional about positive development. We have to be intentional with positive identity development and understand that, yes, it's not a denial or dismissal of Black struggles, but a refusal to be defined and limited by them. And our younger people who are in the education system and are learning these things are continuously learning that they're not, as good enough. They got all of these problems that we individualize. We have this responsibility as a community to help them and uplift them and validate that, yes, it's going to be hard, but they can do it. And that their identity, their being around is a really valid thing, in spite and despite what everyone is saying or what they're hearing. So that's what I want to say. So the idea of maximizing positive social development is important for every human being, and to have a positive image of their ethnocultural and racial identity. And this effort is important to maintain because, like I said, ethnocultural identity is actually a fundamental need to human being and social development and wellness. So finally, 1 minute, is this focus right here. So today I'm not talking about the outside world. Today I'm talking about us. The focus has to change on improving services within the Afro-Caribbean community, within the Black community, within our communities. Things have to change in the way we provide services and recognizing the different needs and the intersections of these needs and validate diversity of experiences. so that we actually respond to the path and help people in their path towards healing, to reduce stigma, increase acceptance and support, like I said before, and normalize, at some point, it's going to get there, the existence of mental illness within the communities and what does that look like for everyone, which is different for everybody. And that's it. So I'm leaving you with another quote, a very interesting one. You could read it for the next 20 seconds. Thank you.
Merci pour cette belle présentation. Moi, j'ai une question de clarification puis une question. Just pour clarifier, to clarify, the slide where you were comparing European communities with Afro-Caribbean, was it organizations, mental health organization, or just community?
It's institutions, like the whole world. So when you're navigating the world as a Black person with a mental illness, you're not receiving the adequate care as a minority person because you don't fit into that standard. And then when you're within the Black community, who then becomes the dominant community, when you're navigating your own community, you are not receiving adequate care because your minority identity is the mental illness. So there's this standardized way. Does that make sense? I'm not good with graphs, but everybody puts graphs, so I'm like,
I'm curious about the biases involved in their perception and their projection, and wondering about the variable of racism and systemic racism within how each community views that individual. Now, I totally understand that for that individual who's receiving the negative projection, it's negative anyways. But I'm wondering about the impact of systemic racism in both of those communities, how they look at the individual.
well, systemic racism plays a role at all of these pieces. And this is not denying the existence of systemic racism or structural racism. What the piece that we need to understand there is what we play in this, how systemic racism also influences how we work as a community, and how we are still trying to maintain this, don't talk too loud, don't do this like that, you're gonna make us look bad, because the dominant group still sees the Black community as being homogeneous. So one person still represents all Black people. And we're still in this taboo of minority identities. And we also have to understand that one person has to experience something for it to be a problem. And so we can't generalize it, but we can't underestimate the importance of what people are saying and understand and mentioning. So when people are mentioning something, we have to pay attention to it and do something about it. So it plays on both ends, because what's being said is, when my community rejects me, it makes me feel worse than having to navigate the rest of society. And it impacts me more and makes it harder for me to navigate life, because I'm not feeling welcomed within my community where I'm supposed to be able to navigate all of these, where I'm supposed to get support for living my life as a Black person. Yeah,
I just need to say this. So I live with a mental illness, okay? I'm Black. I came to this country at the age of 13. So when you talk about the identities, I'm also Christian, going to church. Where I felt the most accepted is with other people who have mental illness. I went to peer support groups, okay? And that is where, I even felt comfortable talking like a Guyanese with my people who have mental illness. Whereas when I was working as a dietitian, and all that stuff and whatnot, I didn't feel comfortable as a Black person. So I get exactly what you're saying. Yeah. And in my family, oh my God, don't tell anybody you're mad. Don't tell anybody you're crazy. Keep it to yourself. Don't go on medication. What if they know what's gonna happen? Right? So I talked about it, I got with my peers, and that's where I found healing. Well, I mean, the other thing for right? From the bidding, everything else helped, but that's where I got the most.
Right. Like, I mean, I'm also not saying it's the one piece. There's like all of these pieces that this is to be considered.
Thank you.